Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss Me and Orson Welles, starring Zac Efron, Claire Danes, Ben Chaplin, Zoe Kazan, Eddie Marsan, and Kelly Riley, directed by Richard Linklater. Now, I've never seen this movie before, but I know of Orson Welles thanks to Citizen Kane and Mank, a movie I did not like too much. If you saw that review from, 3 years ago, maybe you'll know why. But let's get into this movie since I've never seen this before, and this will be my first two viewings. It's 1937 in New York, and Richard Samuels, played by Zac Efron, is a high school student and an upcoming actor learning about theater and in plays such as as he travels into the city and goes in a record store and meets Greta, Adler, played by Zoe Kazan, who is an actress whom I've seen in things but don't remember her in it until she made a big impression on me in The Big Sick, as she's a writer and she's trying to write a play, and I like their chemistry throughout the movie, despite Greta has a small role in the film. While we follow Richard, who I really like as a character, and Zac Efron does a good job at not making me think of High School Musical as a high school jock in High School Musical. Richard auditions for the Mercury Theater as he sings, and he lands a small role as Lucius in a show called Caesar. And the director of the show is a very young Orson Welles, played by Christian McKay, and his assistant Sonia Jones, Sonia spelled with a J, and played by Claire Danes, teaches him the role as Lucius, as she wants to meet David Olsenik, and the cinematography looks good, very good. And the acting is pretty good by the actors, as they don't make me think of something like a fairy tale, and I credit that to director Richard Linklater for making these performances their own. Richard practices his music and his lines while chatting with Norman Lloyd until Orson comes in and the theater manager have an argument about money, and Orson wants to continue to rehearse, and Orson feels like a jackass throughout the movie as he treats people like crap to make a perfect play, which reminds me of what I hear of James Cameron, for example, as he acts like a jackass to make a perfect movie, as he's a perfectionist, while Orson treats them poorly as he wants a perfect play, and it's true in life, and I like how accurate this movie is. Orson directs Muriel Brassler, played by Kelly Riley, as she tells Orson where to put her when delivering her monologue, and they rehearse as Richard and Norman and another guide have a talk as Sonia shows up and sees how Richard is doing, and she's reading a book called Gone with the Wind, which did eventually turn into a movie of a couple of years later from this world, so she can have a chat with David about something when she meets him. And the dialogue is pretty good written like it was life on stage. Richard chats with Sonia about a letter that she got from David while Richard is rehearsing his lines, and Richard, which is accurate for sure, and Orson asks Richard to speak louder as the next day comes, and Orson calls Richard Jr., and he doesn't really like to be called that, as Orson keeps calling him that until we get to a later scene. And this movie makes me want to learn a little less about Orson Welles, because again, this guy is a jackass. Orson and Richard goes to the radio station as he hits on Lorelei Lathrop, played briefly by Imogen Poots, whom I usually love in the movies, like the Fright Night remake as well as the god-awful Black Christmas remake. And Richard learns about Orson as a radio performer as he promotes his play on CBS, and the film is nicely shot in my opinion. Orson takes Lorelei to someplace fancy and tells Richard to tell everybody he's going to be a little late. Meanwhile, Sonia wants to learn about Richard while watching for Orson to arrive at the theater, and Richard wants to take Sonia on a date and on the next day as the sprinklers go off because of a burnt light bulb at the theater, like it's raining inside. And Orson wants a name of someone who blames Richard, as he's first led to believe it was him, but he says something about bad luck, while Richard hasn't been to school in a while, and he goes to a quiet place and bumps into Greta looking at a piece of art, and have a brief chat, and Richard offers Greta to have Sonia give her story to a friend of hers, boss, and maybe they can bring her story to life. And their chemistry is what makes this movie sing, despite Greta is barely in the movie. After one day of rehearsal, they practice their bows, and learn to project the crowd and get handed out tickets by Richard, and they play the dating game as Richard picks the ticket Sonia has, and they go out on their first date, and the date scene is sweet, and I do like this rehearsal scene as well. Richard goes to Sonia's place after their date, and she kisses him like they must be dating, and the next day comes, and Richard is a happy man as he goes to the theater as it's preview night, and it has people in it for sure, and the lighting messes up as well as many things mess up in the show, like the music wasn't on cue, and the actors felt disappointed in the show that night, and Orson looks even more disappointed than anybody else in the show, and they rehearse again after a failure of a show, and the next day is opening night, and the show wasn't bad, but it could have been a lot worse. Orson calls Richard a gifted actor and gets advice from someone to fight for Sonia after their conversation, and the next day comes and wants to talk with Sonia about staying with Orson at the Mercury, as he wants to fight for her until Orson comes in, and Richard tells him to stop calling him different names, like Junior, for example. And he fires Richard on the spot and calls him talentless. And Richard goes to Orson to get his role back, and he wants to be treated with respect and gets the role for the opening night. And George is for some reason sick, and it's a very packed house, while Richard takes a glimpse at it, and the performance begins, and it's a much better performance than the previous day, and I like the performance even more as the audience loved it, and so do I. After the show, Orson hired another young actor to replace Richard, and Richard hears it after their opening night during the after party, and that he's been replaced, and he gets upset over it as Orson's mind is made up, which is super unfortunate, and it makes me not like Orson Welles as a person. And what I'm talking about is Richard has been replaced by a younger blonde kid, and Sonia ends up meeting David and goes out with him, while she'll never see Richard again, and Richard goes back to school as he answers questions about the show he was in, and one day comes back to the city and meets up with Greta at the museum they went to, as she becomes a public writer for the New Yorker, and they go on their first date as he tells her the play won't work out for a long term, and the climax did work out for the best, and I had a good time viewing this both times I watched this for this review. Now it's time for my rating. I'll give this movie a 7.4 out of 10. I do like the characters, as I credit director Richard Linklater at making me think of their characters and not in things like in High School Musical nor Romeo plus Juliet from Baz Luhrmann, and it's their own performances, which is very good, as the cinematography is very good in this movie. The movie is accurate like its life on stage, while it makes me want to know a little less about Orson Welles, as he could be a jackass throughout the movie, as it is nicely shot in my opinion. If you know anything about Orson Welles like I kind of do, thanks to Citizen Kane, and probably had a role in Mank, as I don't remember that film well enough because I didn't like that movie too much, and this is a good movie for people to know about the man himself, while the scenes with Richard and Sonia makes the movie sing, in my opinion. And I like this movie as it works well as a biopic. And yes, this is a biopic. And this movie is a recommendation, as I had a good time with it at the end of the day. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me, and next time I will be back with, let's see here, Bernie, the one with Jack Black. Back to Jack Black territory, I'll say. And until next time, let's sing.